Starting off this countdown, we have the fear of the unknown. During an interview with astronaut Chris Hadfield, he said that the thing he feared the most about going into space was the fear of the unknown, because anything can go wrong at any time. Plus, no matter how much you prepare, there's no way you can prepare for everything that could go wrong, because you don't know everything that can go wrong. Plus, astronauts are miles away from home with limited supplies and contact. They're pretty much on their own to save themselves if anything does go wrong. So it's the fear of not knowing what's to come that terrifies them. In our 9th spot, we have space junk. Obviously, space is filled with floating space objects, but also tons of man-made junk, like debris from old satellites, rocket ship pieces, lost equipment, you name it. It said that there are 28 million pieces of space debris floating around up there. That's about 6,000 tons of space debris. On top of that, each piece flies around at 18,000 miles per hour. At any second, debris could crash into the astronaut's spacecraft and wipe them out. In fact, it said that even tiny paint flecks can damage a spacecraft when traveling at these velocities. Imagine what anything larger could do. So space junk is certainly something astronauts fear. I mean, I wouldn't be able to sleep. I would be way too paranoid. In our 8th spot, we have loss of communication. When astronauts are in space, they rely on ground control to help them out. Ground control plays a critical part in the space mission success. They make sure that everything goes as planned and that the craft stays on course. So imagine how frightening it would be to all of a sudden lose contact with them. Astronauts are then left alone just floating through space. They then would have to manually fly their spacecraft home. Astronauts have lost connection a couple of times, but it's only been for a couple of hours. Moving on to number 7, we have the toxic atmosphere. According to NASA astronaut Drew Morgan, he is worried about space's toxic atmosphere. He admitted to this on social media when responding to a comment that read, "What is the biggest and most terrifying thing astronauts fear about being in space?" There are a number of things in space that make it so deadly for astronauts. For starters, exposure to space can cause embolism, hypoxia, and hypocapnia. Not only that, but astronauts can get sick from being on the moon. When the Apollo astronauts returned from the moon, they got sick off of the moon dust on their spacesuits. It made their throats sore and eyes water. The particles are so fine, but sharp like glass. In fact, it said that, and I quote, "Particles 50 times smaller than a human hair can hang around for months inside your lungs. The longer the particle stays, the greater the chance for toxic effects." But there are so many other things in space that can have a negative impact on the astronauts, like exposure to UV rays and radiation, which can cause cell mutation. Also, there's no pressure in space. The lower the pressure, the lower a liquid's boiling point is. But since in space there is no pressure, the boiling point can easily drop to an astronaut's body temperature, meaning their blood and other liquids in their body would start to boil. Not a pleasant way to go, that's for sure. In our 6th spot, we have the depressurization. Astronaut Drew Morgan claims that astronauts are also scared of depressurization. He said, and I quote, "There's always the possibility that we could depressurize, or that a hole could be punctured by a micrometeoroid or something and we could leak our atmosphere overboard." So let's say that an astronaut was exposed directly to the vacuum of space. Since space doesn't have atmospheric pressure, the astronauts' lungs will expand and burst. After that, the water in their soft tissues will vaporize, causing their whole body to swell up. Then bubbles would form in the veins, blocking blood flow, and the astronauts' bowels, bladder, and stomach will explode, expelling their contents. But don't worry, the astronaut would die from loss of oxygen first before all of that happens. Still, it's terrifying to think of. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with getting sick. In space, there's no hospitals, there's no nurses, there's no doctors. So if you get sick or injured, you're on your own. You need to rely on your crew members to help you out. This is another fear for astronauts, getting sick while in space or seeing their crew get sick while in space. Also, if one person gets sick somehow, chances are others will too. Space is a pretty germy environment. When a person sneezes on Earth, the snot particles shoot out about 3 to 6 feet, and then gravity knocks them out of the air into the floor. But in space, there's no gravity, so if an astronaut sneezes or coughs, it's lingering in the air for their companions to breathe in and enjoy. As a result, sickness or diseases can spread really fast. Another fear they have is dying in orbit, because A, that would suck, and B, what are the crew members supposed to do with the astronaut's dead body? They'll be stuck living beside it for days until they return home. Has to be traumatizing. Moving on to number 4, we have the mechanical failures. This is another fear that Chris Hadfield brought up that's common among astronauts. astronauts, and that's fear that they will experience some sort of mechanical failure or defect, whether that be during liftoff, while in orbit, docking, or re-entry. I mean, there have been a number of disasters already, like the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds into the flight. As a result, the shuttle broke down over the Atlantic Ocean and all 7 crew members on board lost their lives. This was due to a failure of the O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. In space, if their spacecraft fails or if their systems malfunction, they're pretty much screwed, so no one can come out there to save them. Moving on, number 3, we have floating off into space. Although it's never happened to any astronauts so far, it's a very real fear that astronauts have. And hey, I don't blame them. Anyways, if astronauts spacewalk, they have to tether themselves down. If those tethers fail, oh boy, they're drifting out into space. No matter how much they kick or flail their arms, it won't bring them back to the shuttle. Now, NASA does have these emergency jetpack things that can help fly them back to safety, but if the fuel runs out, they're in trouble. They'll be floating around for 7.5 hours until their breathable air runs out, or until they get hit by space junk and die, or the space junk could cause a hole in their helmet or suit, and then we know what would happen, okay? So yeah, I can see why astronauts are afraid of getting separated from the spacecraft and floating away. Moving on to number 2, we have the re-entry. So let's say everything goes fine. Takeoff was a success, the crew survived orbiting space and landing on the moon. Now the only thing they have left to do is come back home. You'd think that they would be excited, you know, to be back home, eating normal food and, you know, being where gravity is. Turns out returning home is something that they fear, and that's because they could burn up or get destroyed upon re-entry. This happened in 2003 with the Columbia Space Shuttle. Upon re-entering Earth's atmosphere, the shuttle started to disintegrate. Sadly, all 7 crew members on board lost their lives. And now if they do manage to survive re-entry, they gotta worry about landing safely instead of just crashing down full speed into the ground. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the catastrophe. Honestly, I never even thought about this, but according to Chris Hadfield, some astronauts are afraid of a huge catastrophe occurring on Earth while they're off the planet. Now you might think, hey, that's good, at least you weren't on the planet to witness it, but hello, that means that Earth is now in ruins and their loved ones are dead. Who's gonna be alive and at NASA helping them navigate back home? Chances are, nobody, so they would be stuck in space, just orbiting around until they run out of supplies. And even if they did somehow re-enter Earth successfully, they're coming back home to nothing. And that's a pretty dark thing to think about. Starting off this countdown, we had the fear of heights. Now you might be like, why would you become an astronaut if you're afraid of heights? Don't ask me, but NASA astronaut Drew Futzel has a fear of heights, but this hasn't impacted any of his missions. In 2018, days before he was sent back into space, NASA released a video revealing 5 facts about the astronaut that people might not know. For one of the facts, he revealed he is afraid of heights. But like I said, this hasn't affected his missions. He has spent a total of 29 days in space and completed 42 hours of spacewalks over the course of 2 missions. That's pretty insane. Whereas other astronauts think that they're fine and they're not afraid of heights until they go to space and they're like, whoa, okay, look at Earth down there, we're really high up. In our 9th spot, we have the damage. Now in part 1 of this video, I talked about mechanical failures. That's something that astronauts fear. Something that they also fear that is kind of along the same lines would be spacecraft failure. Like the craft itself getting damaged and it starts breaking apart. That's what's protecting the astronauts from space. If their craft breaks down, they are pretty much stranded. How are they going to return home without a vessel to travel in? While extensive steps are taken to avoid this, it can still happen at any moment. They could get hit by a meteoroid or by space junk and it could easily bang up the craft and cause unrepairable damage. Or chemical leaks or air leaks. You just never know. And this is what keeps astronauts on their toes. In our 8th spot, we have the return home. I can only imagine how life-changing going to space would be for someone. It could change an astronaut's life forever, but not always in a positive way. After being in space for so long, they are not used to the conditions of Earth. Some astronauts have developed really bad anxiety after returning home. The cause for this is the constant stimulation. In space, it's pretty quiet. When they return home, they need to get used to the noise of crowds and everything constantly going on around them. This often overwhelms them. Others worry about the physical impact space has on their body. Getting used to gravity again apparently makes astronauts feel really sick, and for months they feel woozy and they feel like they're just gonna throw up constantly. Also, when astronauts return home, it throws off their balance, so it's like learning to walk all over again. Honestly, at this point I'm like, where are the pros of going to space? All I see are cons. Moving on to number 7, we have dying. One of the most common fears in the world is the fear of dying. If you stay out of harm's way, you have a less chance of dying. But for astronauts, well, they're being sent into the unknown. Anything could happen at any given time and they could die. I think we all know by now how dangerous their job is. So I mean, it makes sense that astronauts would be fearful of losing their life in space. Moving on to number 6, we have the orbit fire. This is pretty crazy. Fires in space are very real, and a flame in microgravity can be even more dangerous than a fire on Earth. Why? Well, the flame can survive on less oxygen and can burn for a longer period of time. This actually happened in 1997 aboard the Mir space station. On February 24th, 6 crew members were in serious danger when a fire ignited aboard the craft. According to one of the astronauts aboard the craft, he said, and I quote, "The fire was so enormous and the smoke and vapor coming off this fire site was such that we couldn't see at arm's length, and I could not at that time have imagined that we go on with the mission." Now they did end up putting out the fire, but what made this so dangerous is that it took a while before the fire was even detected. That's because on Earth hot air rises, so the smoke detectors pick up on the smoke and then the alarm sounds. In space, the smoke doesn't flow like that, it will just follow the flow of the ventilation systems, meaning it will take a while before the smoke detectors do pick up on it. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with getting trapped. Imagine being miles and miles away from home with no way to get back. This is another thing that astronauts fear. They get sent into space and it ends up being a one-way ticket. Whether that be their craft malfunctions and there's no way to fix it, or from losing permanent contact with ground control, who knows? But if they do get trapped in space, they're kind of SOL, just floating around for days until they run out of food, supplies, or oxygen, or all of the above. In our 4th spot, we have the oxygen. At any time, a spacecraft could lose air pressure and oxygen and then become a death trap for the astronauts. There's just tons of things that could go wrong with the oxygen in space. Like for the Apollo 13 mission, the crew experienced a blown oxygen tank and the other was leaking very fast. Thankfully, they were able to stop the leaks and had enough breathable air to still make it home. But still, it could have ended much worse. Now, what would happen in the worst case scenario if they lose air pressure and oxygen? Well, the astronauts wouldn't die instantly. They would black out in about 15 seconds because in that amount of time, deoxygenated blood will have arrived to their brain. With no oxygen, the brain shuts down pretty dang fast. Also, low pressures will force the gas exchange in their body to start reversing itself. So the oxygen will be pulled out of your body and thrown into the lungs, where it's released out of the body. If you try holding your breath, your lungs will probably rupture. Then you'll experience hypoxia, your skin will turn blue, you'll lose vision and convulse, among other nasty things like having your body just swell up. So yeah, I can see why that scares astronauts, yeah. In our 3rd spot, we have the ammonia leak. This is apparently what NASA trainers tell astronauts. They say, and I quote, "If you smell ammonia, don't worry about running the procedure because you're gonna die anyway." How great is that? How reassuring. So liquid ammonia is used to keep the station's electricity generating solar panels cool. However, ammonia is highly toxic. In March of 2021, 2 astronauts doing a spacewalk outside of the International Space Station had to be checked for ammonia contamination. The 2 were outside fixing the cooling system when frozen flakes of ammonia were released. The astronauts had to have their suits inspected for ammonia crystals before returning to the station. If it's brought inside, well, it's hella corrosive and also a huge irritant to one's eyes and lungs. In our second spot, we have the suit problems. Probably the worst time for an astronaut's suit to malfunction would be when they're out on a spacewalk. This happened in 2001 with Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield. He was out on a spacewalk when his left eye suddenly started to sting and fill with tears. Well, the tears ended up forming a blob of fluid that covered his right eye. So he's got his left eye stinging and tearing up, and we got his right eye obstructed by the tears. So he was left blinded while out in space. Now, Chris was worried that maybe his eye was stinging because of a toxic gas leak in the suit. So ground control told him to release all the air in his suit to get rid of the potential contaminant. So this guy's in space, he can't see, and now he's told to get rid of all breathable air. I would be like, hell no, I'm not doing that. But Chris did as he was told, and that did the trick. Turns out, thankfully, the thing that irritated his eyes was the anti-fogging agent that was applied to the inside of his visor. So it was nothing deadly. And in our number one spot today, we have the drowning. Now, you might be thinking, Lindsay, how does one drown in space? Well, it's actually much scarier than you actually realize. And this happened on July 16th, 2013 to ECA astronaut Luca Parmitano during his spacewalk. So Luca was out on his spacewalk when he felt water on the back of his neck. Turns out that some contamination blocked a fan pump in his suit, which caused the water to back up and start filling his helmet with coolant water. Soon enough, the water in Luca's suit was blocking his vision. He had no way to clear his eyes, nose, or mouth. Thankfully, he was able to make it back to the space station just in time before he drowned.